On the top floor of the Halverton Gallery, the late light lay along the polished parquet like a thin spill of honey. It was a Chelsea evening of conspicuous mildness, and from the tall open windows the breeze came and went with the tact of a well-bred apology. One could hear, when conversations ebbed and the pianist lifted his hands for a moment's rest, the faint pinprick of a taxicab's horn somewhere below, and the river asserting itself with an unhurried swish. It was a select crowd that had come to witness Sir Leonard Halverton's unveiling of his newest portrait. Painters, patrons, an authority from the museum, two actresses with impeccable profiles, the critic who could be relied upon to be intelligent and unpleasant, and a scattering of people who had drifted upward on the buoyancy of social custom. These made, in their several ways, a tapestry of attentive faces and controlled voices. Inspector Roderick Alleyn, who was not in duty but in attendance, stood a little apart with his wife. Troy, dressed with her usual unassuming exactness, had been claimed early by small, admiring phalanx. Alleyn watched her remove one glove, slow and deft, to examine an etching thrust under her nose by an eager young man, and felt, as he always did in rooms devoted to painting, the curious peace that art bestowed upon her. He liked rooms like this, the delicate smell of varnish and old roses, the weather of muted flattery, the hush before a curtain was drawn. Pollock, Sir Leonard's butler, moved among them with his grave, teetotal efficiency. He had the measured step and the unmoving shoulders of the accomplished servant. His hands, in their pale gloves, held the tray as if the glasses were thoughts that must on no account be upset. Champagne fluted under a gentle fizz. 3 decanters waited on a side table with their silver labels dangling: Madeira, white port, sherry. Alleyn noticed in passing that the white port was old and golden, and that its label had been burnished with an attention amounting to affection. "Mr. March," Pollock murmured, as if echoing a name in a library. "The white port," said Julian March, accepting it. He was a thin man whose tie seemed tied by someone who disliked him. One must conform to one's clichés. His eyes, which had the habit of seeing the joke and pretending not to, flickered along the room and came to rest upon the veiled picture. The silk curtain drawn over the portrait breathed very slightly from the stir of air. Hugh Carfax, a young painter with careful hair and paint under his nails, followed the direction of March's gaze and swallowed. He stood near the wall where a discreet bell pull dangled, and his hands, which could be so exacting when they enclosed a brush, were awkward about his glass. He had brought his patroness, Lady Honoria Vellum, whose diamonds were that interesting shade somewhere between innocence and defiance. "Do you think he'll have gilded her?" she asked in a voice meant to be playful. "Sir Leonard would if he thought he could make it look like truth. He always gilds a subject somehow, even when he's being cruel." "Cruel is so useful a word," said Dr. Emmeline Courtauld, who wrote about art with the coolness of a woman accustomed to male exasperation. "It is what we call accuracy, when accuracy touches a nerve." Sir Leonard, who had been late on purpose, made his entrance as if he were apologizing to the room for its own anxiety. He had large features that had been scolded by time into a handsome austerity. His hair, still abundant, was iron grey. He kissed Lady Honoria's hand with the ritual of an old school trained not to inquire too much of motive, and shook March's fingers as if taking the temperature of a patient. His secretary, Miss Lydia Crane, kept close to his shoulder. She was a slender woman with manageable hair and a face that had been taught to be useful. She held the catalogue book as a nun might hold a missal, and regarded the room in glances, half shy and wholly attentive. "We will not keep you," Sir Leonard said. "Our friend here," he indicated the veiled rectangle, "has been listening long enough." The actress who had sat for him stood near the French window. Miss Fenella Ashe had that particular ease which comes when grace and training agree upon their terms. It made her beauty appear unlabored and her composure a kind of politeness. She wore a dress that pretended not to be expensive and was. At her elbow hovered a young man whose military mustache, had been grown as an afterthought. Captain Peter Wetherill carried himself as if he expected to be appraised for something he could not quite name. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sir Leonard said, "I present a portrait that, if we may be forgiven this, has already acquired a nickname." He drew the cord. The silk slid aside with a whisper. For a moment, the room seemed to lean. The portrait was better than even those who had thought themselves prepared had expected. The head, delicately turned, met the viewer with a look which was not a smile and not remoteness. The mouth, rather too expressive for good breeding, held itself with decided courtesy. Behind, no background of generalized gloom, but a faint suggestion of pale silk gathered and loosened, like the breath of a curtain. The light on the shoulder was like the arrival of an idea. There was the collective pause and the usual murmur. An actress gave an appreciative sigh intended for the painter rather than the painting. The critic tilted his glass and said nothing. Lady Honoria said, "Oh," twice, the second time with a tremor of proprietorship. Troy had come to stand quietly beside Alleyn. He felt rather than saw the shift of her concentration. "Well," he murmured. "It's very fine," Troy said softly. "He's been more exact than usual, and kinder than he's been of late. The paint is beautiful. The drawing of the ear is splendid. He can't quite help the theatre in the silk." "The theatre suits the sitter," Alleyn said, not looking at her. "It does." Her voice had that note, oddly like pity, which he had learned to recognize as the sound her judgment made when it acknowledged a strain beneath the surface. She turned her head. Poor child. "Which one?" Alleyn asked. Troy smiled. "Both." Julian March moved forward with his courtesy intact. "The world," he said, "will be grateful to you for confirming what it already suspected. Miss Ashe, you have large allies." "And small enemies, perhaps," Miss Ashe said. She did not flinch when the critic spoke to her. One felt she would not flinch if an accident occurred. "I do not mind small enemies. The smallest people make the sharpest noises." March bowed and turned a fraction to Sir Leonard. "You have given us your silk whisper, invention or accident?" "There is a draft through that wall," Dr. Courtauld said, anticipating any demand for mystique, and pointed with amusement to the moulding above the picture where, if one were the sort of person who noticed such things, a tiny grill could be seen. "The old houses do that. It comforts the superstitious." "Whispering is a reasonable superstition," Sir Leonard said. "It has less consequence than applause, and is often a better judge." Miss Crane's hand, steady on the catalogue, lifted to the cord and let the silk fall as if she were covering the face of a sleeper against a small chill. The draught, however disciplined by architecture, made the hem tickle the gilded frame with a sound that was no sound at all, merely an imagined breath. Alleyn felt it at his sleeve, a ghost of air. He looked aside from the picture and found the butler, silent as upholstery and as essential, collecting empty glasses. Pollock's eyes were correct and unobserving. That is to say, they observed everything and would never volunteer it. He paused an instant by the decanters, straightened a chain label that had got itself negligently twisted, as if such small disobediences were what undid households. "White port is unfashionable," Captain Wetherill announced to no one in particular, and threw back his champagne like a schoolboy doing something defiant. He was deeply sunburned. The shade of his army tan and the glossy black of his hair made him look more foreign than he was. "I must say I don't see the point of all this." Fenella Ashe put her hand lightly on his sleeve without looking at him. "If you don't see the point, Peter, it is because you are facing the wrong way." She said it with laughter and no malice, which made it, Alleyn thought, both more and less kind. Hugh Carfax, who had edged closer to his idol, breathed, "Sir Leonard, may one, do you intend?" and faltered into silence under a glance that was careful not to seem impatient. "My dear Hugh," said Sir Leonard, not touching him, "we will talk presently." Miss Crane, would you remind me about the copy for Mr. Norcott? My mind is a sieve at 7 o'clock. Yes, Sir Leonard, Miss Crane said. There's a telephone message also from Mr. Norcott at the Pall Mall Press. He asks if Mr. March, she inclined her head the distance required, will sup with him after the preview. Scandal conspires in public houses, March said absently, and his mouth showed the satisfaction of a man to whom conspiracy is both sport and sustenance. Lady Honoria leaned nearer to Troy with a confidingness that assumed complicity. He's dreadful, that one, she whispered. He adores the shiver he gives people. Sir Leonard shouldn't encourage him. Sir Leonard encourages oxygen, Troy said. He can't help himself. And you, Inspector? Lady Honoria turned her attention upon Alleyn with the precise curiosity of a hostess who has only just realized that he is not here as a policeman. Are you afraid of whispering pictures? Only when they whisper to the wrong people, Alleyn said, and she rewarded him with a little trill that was as close to laughter as her breeding permitted in rooms of this sort. He looked again at the sitter herself. Miss Ash's composure had cost her something. One could see it in the way her hands met and came apart, in a breath checked and smoothed. There was an inwardness to her that did not belong to actresses alone. He had seen a woman look like that in a witness box. It is very clever, Dr. Courtauld was saying to March, that faint gathering of silk behind the head. A suggestion, nothing more. And the mouth? Halverton's mouth, March said. His own, painted upon other people. He has the good habit of making his subjects resemble him in some minor stiffness. It is how you can tell an artist from a photographer. Mr. March, Sir Leonard said, smiling, your sting is improving with age. Like white port, March rejoined, which I recommend wholeheartedly. He took a delicate sip and let the glass be taken from him by a prompt and apparently clairvoyant Pollock. We must go on speaking of silk. People enjoy it. It keeps them from thinking about hunger. There was a small silence. It was not awkward. It was what comes when a remark leaves too much or too little room. Miss Crane, with the quickness of a woman trained to avert tones unbecoming to rooms, said, Shall I begin a list for those who would like reproductions? The photographer will need to know. How utilitarian, Julian March said softly, but he made a small gesture that was almost gratitude. The hum resumed. The pianist returned to a Debussy prelude, which belonged to this sort of evening as naturally as pollen belongs to summer. People began to arrange themselves in the stable patterns of such gatherings. Those who would be asked to dinner gravitated to the chairs. Those who would not hovered near doorways with the resilience of those who did not mind. Laughter was carefully used. Compliments were trimmed and shaped like topiary. The white port decanter grew lighter by an atom. Alleyn drifted beside Sir Leonard and allowed himself to be presented to Miss Ash. There was a moment, there often is, when the subject of a portrait and the onlooker glance like fences, balancing curiosity and reserve. Inspector, she said. Her voice was softer than he had expected. I suppose you collect impressions as if they could be dusted. As if, Alleyn said. And what is it to you? A very clear likeness, or a very clear lie? I think it is, said Alleyn. What it is to you. And what is that? She smiled and did not wait for an answer. I should like it not to become a fact. I'd like it to remain a rumor about a person I only sometimes am. Sir Leonard heard this and laughed, but there was kindness in it. She is wiser than she knows, he said. Come, Miss Ash, take the fuss while it's warm. I always do, she said, and went to Lady Honoria with an expression of docility that may have deceived both of them. Your butler, Alleyn said without intention, has the air of a man who knows the times of the house by the weight of the trays. Pollock, Sir Leonard glanced at him, the fraction of a rotation that never quite fully included the servants, but never quite excluded them either. Pollock knows the times of the house by the breathing of the walls. He has been with us for 20 years. He can tell the minute by the step outside on the landing. We consult him on drafts." "The house breathes," Alleyn said. "So does your picture." "That," Sir Leonard returned with a flick of amusement at the edge of his mouth, "is because both are alive." Troy had vanished with Dr. Courtauld into a corner patch of serious talk, and the room went on in its lovely pretense that nothing needed to be said too loudly. Alleyn stood and let it pass over him. It was the particular quiet of such rooms, heavy with surfaces and the language of attention. The curtain whispered once for itself, and once, he thought, for someone else. What gives a whisper its power is not the volume, but the choice of ear. He thought, perfunctorily, and without any sense of foreboding, that this would be one of those evenings people would think of later and imagine they had heard more than they had. The party died without a fuss. It slipped rather into that peculiar hush in which good houses seem to listen to themselves. Stratton House, having provided champagne, talk, and a certain quantity of heavy compliments, drew back into its mouldings and cornices with the air of a grande dame at the end of a route. Fan shut, eyes half closed, the pulse still. Bristow, who had been butler in 3 houses and seen the close of more evenings than he would have said, went on his round. It was not ostentation in him to move noiselessly. His step, the thinning of his hair, the careful way in which he tested a lamp's wick before lowering it, were all of a piece with Stratton House's way of being. In the passage below the long gallery, he paused, as he always did, and listened. The gallery had its own temper. It held the portraiture of 200 years. It was long and bare as to noise, and because of a misfitted sash at the far end, there was almost always a faint flow of air along the line of portraits. It made, when all was silent, a susurration, edging the silk of curtains, fingering the hair at the nape, an habitual whisper. Tonight it was more distinct, the light-to-dark draught under a lamp fringe. Bristow turned the handle and opened the gallery door upon a pale ellipse of lamplight and the high walls with their faces. The new picture, Mr. Lanyard's Portrait in a Quiet Key, hung to the left of the chimney-piece, its sitter's eyes catching the light as the others did not. It had been praised and attacked in little breaths all evening. The room smelt faintly of lilies and varnish. Someone had forgotten to switch off the lamp on the Sheraton table. Beside it, under the new picture, a Regency chair had been drawn a little forward and turned slightly as if whoever had used it had wished to judge the light. Bristow saw, without thinking, he saw that someone was still there. The head inclined, just out of the lamp's axis, the hands composed on the lap. It was so easy to take it for a posture of thought that Bristow advanced 3 paces before his mind corrected his sight. "Sir?" he said, and his own voice sounded too round for the room. It was Dr. Lucian Vale, the critic, thin mouth, delicate bones, the particular tie-pin that had amused Mrs. Pym. He had come and gone all night on soft, clever feet. Bristow remembered him lingering in the doorway, smiling, making an apology to Lady Honoria for being a bore, then passing back into the gallery alone with a fluted glass because he found the thing rather haunting. Bristow had replied a neutral, "As you please, sir," and kept an eye that did not appear to watch. He was now sitting with a curious, almost dutiful stillness. The face had a calm, not quite like sleep. Bristow moved to the other side of the chair. His discretion, long practiced, was like a set of motions that took possession of him. He did not call out. He touched the back of the hand with the backs of his fingers. Coolness, then cold. Upon the polished wood of the table, a glass, half emptied, lay on its side, as if a hand had lost interest in it and let it go. There was a little crescent of liquid that had not run. A remarkable smell came and went with the drift of air, faint and bitter, as if some petal had been bruised to acridity. A napkin, one of the small linen squares Bristow had put out for the glasses, had a dab of grey-green upon it. The novice's smear one sees on the cuff of a man who has given himself up to a painter's studio for an evening and forgotten to be careful. In Vale's case, the dab was on his own cuff too, just at the edge of the wrist. Bristow did not touch it. The draught ticked the lampshade. The whisper went along the canvas edges. From some far room, a clock, as scrupulous as Bristow, detached 12 from the day. He went away without haste. The routine, which in itself was a phlegmatic contrivance for the avoidance of panic, took him down the corridor to the service telephone. He spoke first to Miss March, Lady Honoria's secretary, because Miss March answered in a way that did not rouse the house and did not blunder. Her voice came thinly along the wire. "Miss March," Bristow said, "I'm afraid Dr. Vale is taken unwell in the long gallery." "Unwell? I think, miss, that her ladyship should be told. Quietly." Miss March did it. In a few minutes the library door opened, and Lady Honoria came out with her habitual composure, only slightly delayed by a hand laid to the chair arm as she rose. She had put on a shawl and, absurdly perhaps, had changed her shoes. With her came Mr. Lionel Stratton and the painter, Mr. Sebastian Lanyard, whose face looked older without the public light upon it. Miss Phoebe, the ward, had slipped behind, pale with the adventurous pallor of youth when it meets seriousness at midnight. Mrs. Pym, in a silk wrap of audacious emerald, hovered with the irrepressible courtesy that produces tea at a fire and soothing remarks at a deathbed. Mr. Rook, the solicitor, adjusted his spectacles by touch. They came as if they had been taught how it is done. There was a moment in which no one spoke. It was impossible to maintain the fiction of unwell. The discipline of good breeding made the silence seem almost pious. Lanyard looked once at the painting and then steadily at the man beneath it. His mouth shifted and steadied. Lionel Stratton glanced at the spilt liquor, at the hand, at the chair's angle, made a small movement of inquiry towards Bristow and lowered his eyes. "It would be proper," Lady Honoria said, "to send for a doctor, and Mr. Rook, perhaps you would be so good as to suggest—" "For the police," Rook said, not indelicately. "I am afraid so, Honoria." "Very well." Miss March had the number ready. Her fingers, careful as a pianist's, found it without looking. The house paused again, perfectly quietly, as if a page had been turned and this side of the chapter was in a smaller type. Somewhere in the back region the cook's galley door clicked, registered, and did not open. The maid who had been sent to fetch hot water came to the threshold and, understanding somehow without instruction, went no farther. In the gallery, the whisper went on along the line of faces. The new portrait watched, or seemed to. The long house drew its cool draught about itself and waited. Above the city, the hour moved a degree, towards morning, and in that narrowing interval between the ringing off of Miss March's call and the small commotion at the street door, it was possible to hear, if one were sufficiently foolish, the softest of sounds, canvas under breath, remembering a brush. They had left the gallery as it had been, the lamps burning low, the regimented chairs strung like a quiet troop under the north wall, the easel and velvet curtain retired, and the portrait hung in its brave gilt armor above the long console. The draught, which had put it into the heads of some susceptible persons that the painted lips could murmur, showed itself as the faintest, almost domestic stir among the tassels of the curtain cords and a recurrent sigh in the upper cornice. The air held lilies and varnish, and underneath a steadier smell of coffee cooled to an unkind temper. Alleyn came in the way he did when rooms had lately seen more than they wished, like a courteous stranger who will touch nothing. At the door, Fox paused his large, unobtrusive bulk, and the uniformed constable withdrew his gaze from the dead man and fixed it instead on the far skirting board, as if that might blush or look away. The body sat, rather sat than was placed, in a low gilt chair beneath the portrait. Sir Julian Rook, if one could still grant him his baronet's style, had been a critic and was now a figure rescued from caricature by mortality's cleaning hand. His head rested on the chair's wing with a mild, fallen look. On the console at his elbow stood the saucer and cup, one of those tiny pieces that make coffee look like a draught from a doll's set. A spoon lay across the saucer, its bowl stained pale brown. There was, too, a thin ring on the polished wood, and another, fainter, some inches away. That second circle had no companion. Alleyn stood looking at both. Fox, who knew him very well, did not speak. He had that affection which lets silence do a portion of the talking. The portrait, this much touted whispering, took up one's eye in the fashion of things painted from life and made to suggest something more. A young woman looks out. Her dress is not so much costume as an arrangement, a cloud of muted silk, and in the handling of the mouth there is a delicate uncertainty that has been called by the papers breath. It had been heavy with suggestion in the crowded room. Now, with the dead man at its foot, it was merely good. Alleyn moved forward, and as he did so, the room let him have small confidences. A slight disturbance of the pile in the Aubusson rug near the far chair, a scuff mark on the skirting by the window where someone, in the darkness of the demonstration, had misjudged the distance, a smudge of something dark along the lower right of the gilt frame. No, not pigment, but a thumb's breadth of coffee dulled by gilding dust. He put no finger to it. He leaned instead a little to the right and felt the draught on his cheek. There was a minute. Grill invisibly set behind the moulding. Old houses have their means of speaking. One could imagine the housekeeper's voice, once upon a time riding the tube to the pantry. Now the air conversed with the portrait and made mischief among suggestion. From the landing behind came the faint, ordered sound of a household confined to propriety. A couple of servants stood at the top of the stairs, as if a newel post had grown aprons. In a back drawing-room, low voices tried for normality and missed. He had seen Lady Leonora for precisely 20 seconds in the little morning-room, very composed, one hand, with all its fine whiteness, resting on the back of an upright chair, a profile that had the gravity of restraint. "Inspector," she had said, "whatever is proper." And the word had more mournfulness in it than any tears would have done. He bent and put his face near the cup. If the old-fashioned vulgar odor was present, it was no longer crudely obtrusive. It had retreated into the china. He straightened, glanced at the small silver salver standing further along the console with 3 other cups, ranged in chastised symmetry, all with the house cipher, all half drunk. One saucer was bare. The little neat butler had told Fox that coffee was served after the curtain was drawn back and the lamps lowered, one of the small rituals that made an entertainment seem inevitable rather than contrived. On the velvet seat of the chair, 2 inches from Sir Julian's right hand, lay a folded theatre program from the St. Idris. Alleyn glanced at the printing and put it gently down again. There was a smear on the edge. Powder, perhaps, from a lady's glove, or the chalky ghost of face powder accustomed to rest on programs and gloves and lapels in the decent crush of an interval. The dead man's lapel carried a gardenia that had not quite enjoyed itself. Its outer petals were bruised. He looked, too, at the company's traces. A handkerchief with a narrow hem lay beside an empty chair, dropped and retrieved and dropped again. The folded corner bore a discreet C worked by hand. Celia, cousin. In the lower light, a thread had been caught from someone's silk on the edge of a carved console foot. It shone a pale, broken blue. Upon the polished floor, near the door, a minute crescent lay dull and sly, a clipping from a fingernail. "Sir?" Fox's voice, weighty and deferential, the big man holding the door so as to keep drafts where they belonged. "In a moment," Alleyn said. "We'll let them sit together 5 minutes longer." He went to the window and touched the edge of the curtain. A whisper from the hidden vent replied, like the dry voice of a schemer. He could feel in this room the manner in which it had nearly given itself up to a vogue and now must endure a more vulgar fame. He had watched earlier the way the painter, Mr. Markham, had kept his eyes on the hostess when the portrait was uncovered, not on the portrait itself, and the way the secretary, Mr. Stephen Gray, had counted chairs with his eyes before the guests came in as if numbers could be an inoculation against accident. A retired military gentleman had placed himself with his back to the door, as if to hold it in order, and one easily flurried young actress had laughed twice, in that high way that trembles to hysteria and then remembers her lessons. He waited. In these rooms, it was habit that failed first and then, rattled, told tales. A missing spoon, a cup that had traveled when it should have stayed. The tiny affront done to a footman's choreography would reveal more than any confession. He looked once more at the portrait and its whispering mouth, and at the man under it who had been accustomed to say what people thought they ought to have said themselves. He was aware, because practice cannot be unlearned, of the housewife neatness in the butler that had been slightly ruffled, and of the little blunt eyes of the housekeeper counting the cups, of a young pair of hands, with paint at the nail beds, clasping and unclasping somewhere beyond the door. "Very well," he said to Fox. "We'll disturb them." And in his mind he had already set the room to its proper measure, as a man sets a metronome and listens for the first betrayal of time. Alleyn asked for a small room and was given one with a bow window that admitted a triangular wedge of Bloomsbury light. The Ashenden townhouse, skilled in discretion, had such rooms like lidded boxes tucked into its corners, quiet, hung with pictures that did not speak, and furnished with chairs that made confidences seem merely the natural consequence of sitting. Mr. Fox, having dealt with formalities, established himself as a courteous guardian at the door. The butler, Loder, brought in a tray with tea, silver, slightly old-fashioned, and then effaced himself, which was his métier, and, Alleyn thought, perhaps his protection. Lady Sybil Ashenden came first, drawn, composed, and with that particular English air of having signed a treaty with calamity. She took the chair at the window as if it had been allotted to her at birth, folded her hands with a small twitch that looked like the suppression of a sentence, and said, "You will be as kind as you can, Inspector. We are not used to, well, I suppose we must become used." "Will you tell me," said Alleyn, "how the evening had been intended to run?" She gave him the program in quiet phrases. The portrait, the whisper at dusk, as the restorers had chosen to call it, had been rehung in the long gallery. There had been a little speech by Dr. Vale, a little acknowledgments by Lady Sybil, a toast, and then, very properly, people had dispersed into couples and trios to look again. "It is always so," she said. "One returns to the thing, having heard somebody declare it remarkable. And Dr. Vale, he was punctilious. He had charge of the catalogue, the invitations, even the drinks. He believed that trifles are a kind of scholarship." "Did he have enemies?" She lifted her eyes with mild reproach. "He had standards." Alleyn let that rest, thanked her, and asked after her daughter. "Caroline is terribly shaken. She will be brave for you. Caroline is more her father than me in such matters." It was said without self-pity and with a faint hauteur that asked him not to press certain doors. Miss Caroline Ashenden was indeed brave. She came in quickly, sat on the edge of the chair, and answered him in a clear, upper voice that shook but did not falter. She had liked Dr. Vale. He had been kind, if dry. He had given her a small book about the painter with the strange biography who had, in his middle years, painted women as if they were thinking of something else. "The portrait whispers because the house is old," she said, with a young person's determination to strip romance from horror. "There's a draught in the panelling. We children used to put our ears to the wall and invent." "That is very likely," Alleyn said. "You were near Dr. Vale when the toast was given?" "No, I was with Mr. Dane, the restorer, because he was explaining why there is a faint bloom around the subject's mouth that isn't quite lipstick and isn't quite age." She gave him a look, half apologetic for the detail and half defiant of what it might imply. "I did not notice what Dr. Vale drank." "Thank you. One more thing. Were you aware of any understanding between Dr. Vale and any of your guests?" Her composure slipped a degree. "Mother says that such questions are inevitable. I have nothing to tell you." The last words, said very evenly, had the curious sound of something that had been given her to say. Mr. Felix Dane followed, slender, cautious, with the careful hands of his profession and a habit of looking beyond the person addressed, as if appraising a varnish. He stood until Alleyn insisted he sit, and when he did sit, placed one palm flat on his knee, the other on the chair's arm, as if fixing himself in a thought. "I imagine," Alleyn said, "that you find this peculiarly unfortunate." "It is an affront to the work," said Mr. Dane, and then coloured slightly. "Forgive me, a man is dead, but one's mind is trained to order." To order? To procedure, solvents, cotton wool, the routine that keeps the hand from trespassing. Dr. Vale had a horror of trespass. And yet, he had enlarged the occasion. I had advised a very quiet rehanging. He preferred an audience. He gave a tiny, helpless movement of the shoulders. Scholars become impresarios. It is a period disease. Did you have words? Mr. Dane looked at his palm as if something might be written there. We had differences about titles, phrasings, and one decorative sprig in the catalogue. It was nothing. Method quarrels always feel important to those engaged and absolutely comical to those who are not. Sir Peveril Manx came in with the odour of a cigar he had not been permitted to smoke, and the air of a man who expects deference as a solvent universal. He considered the chair, decided it could not contain him, and remained upright. "I can't be detained," he said with genial hostility. I knew Vale. Fellow was useful. If you imagine that I have time to parry insinuations— "I don't," said Alleyn. "Only this. Did you drink the same as Dr. Vale?" Sir Peveril stared at him as if the question were an epigram he did not entirely understand. "Champagne. A deplorable vintage." The man was a terror for economies. If you want scandal, look for it in the dowagers. They have the motives and the patience. Did you notice where Dr. Vale went when the company dispersed? Into the small room off the gallery. He loved to adjust things. He couldn't see a picture straight without laying hands on it. I suppose he went to admire himself. Mrs. Livia Meriden, the actress, arrived like a fragrance that had thought twice about entering. She was not in the first youth, but had conserved, by art or fatality, the sense of always having a window at her back. She sat easily, letting her gaze travel with amusement over the tea tray, the little table, and Alleyn's face. "I hardly knew him," she said. "We met in the foyer, and he was disapproving in a way that I found restful. Actors are petted so much that a little froideur is like tonic." "You spoke together at some length," said Alleyn, who had seen them in the gallery, the tilt of her head more dramatic than anything else that night. "At some length," she smiled. "Inspector dear, your some length is every woman's 5 minutes. He was telling me that the portrait would be talked about by people who do not look. I told him we have much in common." Mr. Peter Quain, Dr. Vale's assistant, was pale and careful. He had the face of a young man who arranged his expressions as one arranges papers. He folded and unfolded his hands. "I wrote the labels," he said without prompting. Dr. Vale corrected them. He corrected most things. There is an elegance in correction if it is done well. "You found him," said Alleyn. "Yes, in the little room. He looked—" He stopped, and what little colour he possessed drained. He looked as if he were listening. It was— "I beg your pardon." "You've nothing to beg," Alleyn said. "Did anyone go in before you?" "I think Mr. Dane passed along the corridor. Lady Sybil asked Loda for more glasses. Sir Peveril had drifted to the staircase. Miss Ashenden stood at the door of the gallery as if it were a stage in a dream. You noticed much. I was trained to notice footnotes." He gave a tiny, desperate smile, and it was the first unarranged thing he had shown. Alleyn let him go and asked for Loda. The butler reappeared with teacups unshaken by his hand, and with an expression as nearly non-existent as a face can be, and still be called a face. Alleyn did not yet invite him to sit. He asked instead for particulars of the service, the order of the toasts, the provenance of the champagne, who had been given which glass. Loda provided an inventory as impersonal as a shopping list, but over it lay a silkiness that was not mere breeding. "We do not often have trouble," Loda said when Alleyn thanked him. He placed the tongs precisely between the lemon slices, as if this too were part of a narrative. "I expect not." Alleyn looked at the quiet window, the pale wedge of light now lengthening. "I will talk with you again." He would. For the present, the elegant tributaries had been sounded and had given nothing away but the shape of their banks. He sent them back to their rooms in lingering groups and returned, for a moment, to the gallery where the portrait hung, with that faint half-smile that was not smile at all, only suggestion. There was, always, the thing people had decided to be true, the whisper. He stood quite still and thought he heard it, which was surely only the house. Old timber, solemn draught, that civilized unsettling. And because houses have their routines and their secrets, he let that small sound settle, made a note of who had placed what where and when, and prepared himself for the conversation with the one person in such houses who always knows and almost never says. The house had subsided into that particular quietness which follows a disturbance but precedes sleep. A hush attentive to its own breathing. Constables moved with shoes softened by conscience. In the silver pantry, the air was lemon-scented and rigidly exacting. It might have been a chapel if chapels possessed hot water and racks for goblets. Alleyn found Chivers there, upright as a candlestick, measuring polish against reflection. "I wonder," Alleyn said, "if we might talk a little, Mr. Chivers. Here is as good a place as any." Chivers's face arranged itself into duty. "Certainly, sir." He was a narrow man with a valeted demeanor, so self-effacing that it became, paradoxically, a style. He had large, precise hands, whose economy of movement suggested that waste, in his world, occurred chiefly in syllables. "You served the drinks in the long gallery, and later, in the little ante-room," Alleyn began. He understood that the ritual had to be acknowledged before it could be examined. "Yes, sir. The sherry was taken on a silver salver. The Madeira stood by the fireplace for those who preferred it. A decanter of brandy was placed in the anteroom at Lady Eugenia's request." "Who carried it to the anteroom?" "Myself, sir. Mr. Sykes." He shaped the name with a tact that bestowed upon the deceased an honorable neutrality. "Expressed a wish for quiet. Lady Eugenia suggested he might find it there." Alleyn looked, not at Chivers, but at the linen laid in a pale fan on the dresser. "When you found Mr. Sykes later, did you alter anything in the room?" Chivers' eyelids performed an almost imperceptible operation. "No, sir," he said, and then, "That is, I set aside a glass that was chipped. I removed it to prevent an accident in the presence of officers, sir. It would reflect poorly on the house if a man cut his lip on an inferior glass." Fox, who had come in soundlessly and stood at a respectful distance, shifted his weight a fraction. Alleyn did not look round. "Where is that glass now?" "In the sink, sir. I regret the impropriety." Alleyn considered the shining ranks. It isn't impropriety to preserve what can be preserved. One lives by one's training. Which glass was used by Mr. Sykes? "The other, sir." "And you are certain?" Chivers paused. "As certain as my position allows, sir." It was an answer of scrupulous caution. Alleyn accepted it as a small confession, not of guilt, but of loyalty, misplaced. "Tell me," he said, "about the portrait." Chivers permitted himself the astonishment of a butler asked to gossip. "The old portrait, sir, of Mrs. Rosamond Davenant. There is some nonsense among the younger staff about it. The whispering. I've explained that when the back corridor windows are open, and the register of the old flue is not quite shut, one hears an effect. A whisper. If you insist, sir. Does the door from the service passage open directly upon that corner of the gallery?" "It does, sir." "And was it used tonight?" Chivers looked at the lemon rinds in their crystal bowl as if seeking there a defense. The house was full, sir. The door may have been used. By whom? Alleyn did not ask the vulgar question. He saw instead the pale movement of Chivers's throat and the delicate humiliation that trembled in the arc of his hands. He would not compel an answer, not yet. "The decanter," Alleyn said. "Do you lock them away between courses?" "At all times, sir." "And tonight?" "Tonight I took out the brandy myself and returned it myself." "At what time?" 11 o'clock, sir. The clocks had struck." "Thank you," Alleyn said. "We will look at the glass presently. Mr. Fox?" When Chivers had gone, he and Fox examined the sink, which had the cleanness of an altar. One glass stood apart, tilted on a cloth. Its lip showed the faintest crescent of a flaw, and on the linen was an amber bloom the size of a coin. Alleyn touched it with a finger and lifted it to his face. There was nothing. Chivers's world had already effaced it. "Loyal cove," Fox murmured. "Yes," said Alleyn, "and not blind." The housekeeper received them in the linen room, a sober compartment, odorous of starch, with shelves like ranks of quiet soldiers. Mrs. Dacre had the forbearing expression of those who see everything that happens and expect none of it to be altered. She folded a napkin with precision and set it among its fellows without looking up. "Forgive us," Alleyn said. "It is tiresome, I know. I shouldn't keep you from your sheets if it were not useful." "It is my work to be kept, sir," said Mrs. Dacre, "if I may say so." "You may. Did you observe anything this evening that was not of the usual ritual?" Mrs. Dacre's still face inclined a fraction. "The green ante-room is not commonly used," she said. "It is dusted of a Thursday and open for the airing when there are carpets to beat. Tonight it was opened. The covers were removed from the chairs. That is outside the ordinary." "By whose order?" "Her ladyship consented when it was suggested," said Mrs. Dacre, and permitted the smallest flutter of disdain to touch the last word, leaving it anonymous. "Suggested by whom?" "I was not present, sir." "But you know." Mrs. Dacre's eyes, complicated as old lace, remained perfectly respectful. "I have charge of keys and fires, sir. I'm not in the habit of naming those who ask for warmth." "Very proper," said Alleyn. "The portrait, does it have a curtain?" "Only for the great cleaning, sir. It is not drawn otherwise. There is a register behind it. When the weather comes in from the park, it murmurs." "Were the windows open in the corridor this evening?" "The house was full," said Mrs. Dacre, and allowed the phrase to carry a paragraph. Alleyn followed her glance, which by chance, or by the rigid discipline of not pointing, came to rest upon a narrow door. The secretary's small office beyond. Miss Merton's pen had long ceased its industrious tapping. On the polished table near Mrs. Dacre's elbow lay a single linen towel with an irregular, faint ring upon it, as if some vessel, hastily put down, had bled the ghost of its contents. "Do you wind the clock in the gallery, Mrs. Dacre?" "The under-footman does, sir. At 10. He did not go up tonight until past. There were gentlemen in the way. And he told you so." "He asked if he should go, sir. I told him to wait. It is not for the like of us to brush past." "No," said Alleyn, "it is not." He took his leave with thanks that were not formal, and walked out into the corridor where the old house resumed its quiet. Somewhere behind the portrait there was a small sibilance, no more than a draught remembering the habit of words. Fox touched his sleeve. "Well, sir?" "They know," said Alleyn. "They won't tell. They are quite right. We must notice what they notice and call it something else." He glanced back at the linen room door. "There is a habit in this house, and tonight the habit stumbled." He did not yet name which habit. It would do that itself, presently, if he attended as he ought. He turned toward the gallery again, where the portrait waited with its mouth, half open, as if to breathe. The house submitted to the morning as if it had been trained to do so, with blinds raised to the exact height and the hearths laid with a competence that offered no comment upon death. Alleyn who had asked for the gallery before breakfast, found it empty of everyone except the portrait and himself. It was a cool room. The northern light took the shine from the parquet and flattened the colors. The portrait, with its faint, uncanny illusion of a whisper caught at the sitter's parted lips, held the room as a thought held a mind. He walked the long length of it, pacing slowly, hands behind his back, taking no notes. A high window had been tilted, and a thread of air drifted along the picture rail and made a delicate sound in the old coving, a small hush rather than a draught. He stood before the portrait and saw again the admirable workmanship, the mouth all but speaking, the suggestion of motion under stillness, that tiny captured breath. In its gilded frame hung a curtain for protection against glare. It had been drawn back last night for the viewing, and someone had said, "Tied as it always is." He touched the tasseled cord with a forefinger. The knot that held it, neither servant's bow nor fussy rosette, was a neat, unshowy hitch, the sort that a man might make with one hand while thinking of something else. He had seen, in other houses, the housemaid's way with knots, conscientious and florid. The housemaids at Grayling's, Mrs. Partridge's domain, would not, he thought, be content with this hitch. He lifted the cord an inch. The dust on the bracket beneath had a small, clean scar through it, as if the cord had been slid and checked of late. It was a little matter. He let the tassel fall and stood back. The chair in which Mr. Vane had been found was placed near the portrait's left-hand edge, a courtesy chair, not one to invite occupation. Its arms were polished from long abstention rather than use. He touched them, then the back. On the carved finial there was a faint smear, too slight for smudge, of something transparent that had dried to a tight film and shown itself only by a difference of shine. Varnish? No, more like the residue of finger on French polish. He stepped away. At the far end, beyond the last portrait and the small glazed press of miniatures, there was the bell pull. Alleyn had noticed it the night before because it was old-fashioned and unashamed of being so. Silk tassel, faded by touch rather than sun. He pulled it gently. Somewhere in the understructures, a bell would have stirred and trembled. He did not want the butler. He wanted to know if the old mechanism still answered. It did. A faint quiver under his hand. He let it go, and, this time deliberately, set himself to find the service passage and the bell-board. Bracknell, faultless as a statue on a plinth, materialized at the turn of a corridor. "Sir, I fear I have disturbed your morning," Alleyn said. "A curiosity only. May I?" "But certainly, sir." Bracknell ushered him into the small pantry where the bell-board reigned like a modest god. The names of rooms, some current, some with an air of the last century about them, were written in a clerkly hand on small ivory tablets. Above each, a little brass vane would fly up when rung. Alleyn looked at the row until his eye found long gallery. The vane stood docilely in its place, but the ivory tablet beneath it sat a trifle askew. There was a faint blue crescent on the edge of the wood, a mark from the carpenter's pencil or from a servant's folded score on the cricket field. It was not a stain that would bother a large mind. It bothered Alleyn. "I was told last night," he said mildly, "that the long gallery bell is seldom used." "Very seldom, sir," said Bracknell. His face did not move. "Hardly at all. The family prefer to use the little handbell if they require refreshment. Because this pull, for all its venerable look, still quivers prettily." Bracknell's glance flicked to the indicator and away. "Yes, sir." "And you answered it last night?" "Last night I answered the drawing-room, sir," said Bracknell. "And later, when Mr. Vane was found, I went to the gallery with Sir Lionel." "Of course," Alleyn said, and smiled. He was not being unkind. "Mrs. Partridge lights the fires in the front rooms at 6. "At 6:30, sir." "In the little retiring room off the gallery." He kept his voice the same. Bracknell's pause was so small that it might have been courtesy. "Mrs. Partridge attends to that room on special instruction, sir. It is not in general in use." Alleyn thanked him and asked if he might glance at it. They went together and found the little room, which smelt faintly of lavender and had the undefended look of a place that belonged to nobody. The fire there was laid with care that reminded him of a banker's arrangement of coins, kindling and coals in clean geometry, and a spill glass on the mantel shelf. It had not been lit. There was a tiny scatter of grey at the very back of the grate, no more than a suggestion, that told another tale, an old lighting and a careful extinction. On the small occasional table lay a pair of opera glasses and, beside them, a coaster for a glass. The coaster had left a faint circle in the wax. There was no corresponding circle on the table. It had been wiped away, or it had not yet been made. He said that it was a charming room and allowed Bracknell to take him back. In the passage, a maid went by with a blotter and a pot of ink. The detail in this house was like a pattern on water. When one disturbed it, it looked the same again, but the ripples moved under. At the foot of the stairs, the Morning Post lay in its tray, letters marshalled by size. Alleyn's glance alighted on one, a long white envelope with Sir Lionel's name in a hand that had a peculiar slope. There was, by some irony not of his making, a tincture of familiarity in it. He did not stop. He asked very nicely if the post might be held for a quarter of an hour, to allow Sir Lionel a moment's quiet. "Certainly, sir," said Bracknell. "Quite understood." Back in the gallery, Alleyn stood once more before the portrait. The little knot on the curtain cord, businesslike and impersonal, had begun to seem to him eloquent. One does not change a house's small habits without wanting to do so. The whispering hush along the coving came again as the air shifted. It would be something of that order, he thought, that would draw out what had been kept so carefully in place. A stirred bell, a half-made knot, a mark from a pencil on a varnished edge. He looked at the chair. Then he looked at the bell pull and, finally, at the door. He had no wish to hurry anyone. The house would oblige in its own time with one more small movement. He supposed it might begin with the arrival of a letter. By mid-afternoon, the house had adopted that chastened quiet, which follows upon the removal of a body and the arrival of routine. It was as if the rooms remembered, and remembered gravely. In the green drawing-room, Lady Honoria had decreed tea. The saucers scarcely clicked. Conversation, such as it was, went forward on the surface of things and rolled back again without leaving the margins wet. Alleyn, who had the trick of seeming to sit out of his own work, took tea and regarded the group. Florian Quill stood rather than sat, his cup balanced in frangible disdain, his long lashes dark against cheeks that were too remarkable to be innocent. Miss Isabel March kept both hands about her saucer and watched her tea cool. The general, with the aspect of a man who had once managed cannon but now found himself powerless before a teapot, planted himself by the mantel and looked above everyone's head. Mr. Latham, Sir Julian's secretary, had brought the post on a salver and remained. He had that species of essential anonymity which is either perfect training or perfect concealment. Fallow, the butler, had attended long enough to murmur assent to Lady Honoria's theory that nothing improved a shaken system like China tea, and had glided away. Fox came in with that careful tread which in him substituted for stealth. He gave Alleyn a small nod and waited. Alleyn, with a faint apology to Lady Honoria, set down his cup and took the envelope Fox offered on the flat of his palm as if it were a creature that might stir. "To Miss March," he read aloud, mildly. The writing was like Sir Julian's, enough so to pass in a room where one did not expect forgery. The envelope bore the familiar crest. He handed it across to Isabel. "It was found?" he asked, nearly idly. "In Sir Julian's blotter, sir," Fox said. "Wedge under the flap. I'd swear we never saw it this morning." "May I?" Alleyn inquired of Isabel when she hesitated. She handed the letter back without having broken the seal. Her color had drained. The skin about her mouth looked a shade too tight. Alleyn, not reading it, turned the envelope over to the light. The crest had been pressed on soft wax with a signet that dragged. There was a faint smear as if the stone had been lifted and replaced in uncertainty. He slid a nail under the flap, withdrew the single sheet, and glanced down. 3 lines only. Miss March was asked to meet Sir Julian last night at 11:15 by the portrait, as if the household had but one. There was a sentence about our understanding and, ungenerously, the words, "I shall set the matter in order." "Is that—" the General began and stopped. He was looking at Isabel. She had closed her eyes. Lady Honoria's hand, with its fine old bones, touched Isabel's shoulder. "My dear child," she said with the perfect uselessness of kindness offered at the wrong moment. "It is not his style," Florian murmured in the tone of a man pronouncing on an engraving. Sir Julian did not use the definite article so oddly. He would surely have written "the portrait in the North Gallery" or merely "the North Portrait." He was incapable of poetry and imprecision. He sipped and looked over the rim. Mr. Latham cleared his throat. "Sir Julian did not, as a rule, appoint Miss March to private interviews," he said. The sentence was without inflection, which did not soften it. Alleyn folded the letter and placed it on his knee. "Mr. Latham," he said, "you know Sir Julian's hand?" "Intimately," Mr. Latham replied, and seemed to find his own word distasteful. "At a glance I should accept this. On consideration well, Sir Julian crossed his 7s. "This writer does not," Florian observed. Isabel's teacup struck softly on its saucer. "I didn't go," she said, and instantly shut her lips upon the words as if they had escaped. "Excuse me." "No apology," said Lady Honoria, very gently. "We are all at the mercy of our nerves." She re-poured. "Inspector, will this thing make things worse?" "It will make them a little different," Alleyn said. He pinched the edge of the paper and, without seeming to do so, smelt the faint sweetness that clung to it. Not cigar, not dust, a whisper of something used to scent drawers. He looked up, not at anyone in particular. "We shall keep this for the present, if we may." At that moment, oddly as if on cue, there was the smallest rattle from the corridor, porcelain touching wood. Mr. Latham took a step and checked, put a hand to his temple, smiled in apology, and, very quietly, sat down on the nearest chair. His face had gone grey in a strip from cheekbone to mouth. A faint shimmer of sweat sprang up under his hair. Lady Honoria rang. Dulcie, the upstairs maid, came like a leaf blown onto the threshold. "Water," Lady Honoria said, and then, after a fractional pause that only Alleyn noticed, "No brandy." Mr. Latham accepted the water as if it were a ritual and composed himself. "A trifling dizziness," he said. "I have not eaten, I'm afraid." "You will," Lady Honoria said, and to Alleyn, "We are, I think, to endure small dramas now. They will not scream." Alleyn rose and gave Fox the briefest inclination of the head. Fox understood. He always did. "We'll look in the gallery," Alleyn said as if to himself, and moved out under cover of Lady Honoria's civil orders to Dulcie for sandwiches. Behind them, Isabel set both hands flat on the table and seemed to wait for her heart to be quiet. The North Gallery had cooled. The portrait of Lady Honoria's mother, emeritus of beauty, formidable and remote, had its muslin drawn and pinned. A hush lay here like fine dust. The faintest murmur drifted when Alleyn opened the door a precise angle. He waited. The sound, that reminded him of a hand moving over silk, lengthened into something that could be called a whisper and died. He altered the door's set. It returned and seemed to come from the join of wainscot and floor. Fox, who did not care for upholstery talking, cast a skeptical eye. "Draught," Alleyn said, "and perhaps a hollow. One could, I fancy, speak under the stairs and send reassurance into the room. Reassurance, Fox murmured, or the other thing. They found, in the little room behind the gallery where Fallow kept his silver polish and his impeccability, a small grate with a handful of ash that did not belong to the household's timing. The fires here were laid at 5 and slept like good soldiers until they were woken. This had been roused at noon. The ash was new and fox-colored. Alleyn knelt, moved the ash with a pencil, and recovered the half-moon of red wax with a blur where a signet, uncertainly applied, had slipped. He put it with the letter, lightly, as if they shared a family resemblance. "There's a smell," Fox said, not committing himself. "Scented paper," Alleyn answered. He stood, brushed a mote from his sleeve. "We won't announce this for the time being." From the passage, a very faint breath went by them as if someone had walked by and felt slippers. Alleyn opened the door upon emptiness and the faraway sound of Dulcie's feet. When he shut it, the whisper under the wainscot spoke and was still. "We'll go back," Alleyn said, quietly. He did not look at Fox when he added, "And we will say nothing to anyone." He carried the envelope as one would carry something fragile and suspect, and under his calm the pattern began, almost imperceptibly, to take on weight. In the quiet ebb that follows an English fracas, a house recollects itself. The footmen had withdrawn their silver trays as discreetly as undertakers, removing a bier. Doors were shut with the care of a housemaid tending a convalescent. The air, relieved of polite voices and perfume, began to present its true odors: polished wood, cut flowers going faint, the sour, sweet echo of wine. Alleyn stood alone in the long room where the portrait hung and felt the settled calm as something like the surface of a pond once plotters' pebbles have sunk out of sight. The painted face, half turned, seemed to hover between candor and conspiracy. In the soft light, her mouth, broken delicately by the painter's brush, gave that old, teasing illusion of speech. One could easily imagine, if one were fanciful, that a breath moved behind the canvas, returning the whisper it had received. He moved to the lacquered table and considered the silver labels that had marched earlier upon a salver. Port, Madeira, sherry. The last gave him the oddest sense of dolorous propriety. A household's ritual, he had long thought, communicates itself like a catechism. This butler, whose self-effacement was so complete as to be a nearly visible accomplishment, performed a service in which the smallest deviation was as palpable as a wrong note in an anthem. And the wrong note had been sounded. The sherry decanter had worn its label to the right when, by custom rigid as the liturgy at St. Margaret's, it lived to the left. It was the sort of minor trespass that goes unremarked upon by guests and burns like a spark in a servant's mind. He had not pressed the man. He had only let the silence dilate and had seen the momentary dimming of the eyelids, that inward acknowledgement which is as eloquent as speech. The knowledge lay there, under his hand as surely as the list he had made. Names, objects, gestures, misstatements, and those agitations which the very well-bred call nothing at all. Fox had come and gone with the patience of an old oak. The sherry, quarantined, would go under an analyst's gaze, and if the science were kind, it would ratify the nervous surmise that already ran, like a nervous young thing, from room to room, that the quiet death at the heart of the evening had not been the sudden perversity of a body, but the intended end of a mind. And then, as if some malign figure had miscounted doses, the frail lady with the cameo brooch had taken a swallow from the same bottle and been led away, pale and apologetic, to a sofa. The household, mercifully, had a doctor on the premises. She had recovered with a fluttering smile. She had insisted upon the invariable cup of beef tea. He walked the length of the room again. A servant, anxious and biddable, had closed the outer shutters, but left, whether through fatigue or superstition, the inner curtains slightly parted. A thread of draught found its way through the skirting near the portrait. stroked the back of his neck, and vanished. The house had its own systems, its whirls and channels. He thought of the speaking tubes, those blackened trumpets like dates upon an old map, that still served from pantry to dressing room. They were not unconnected with the curious report earlier of a voice on the landing which had no body attached to it. Whispers, seen from the backside of a canvas, would be very much like that. He sat, took out his pencil, and wrote again in that small, neat hand which betrayed nothing of his character. The ritual of the tray, altered. The maid's dusting route, disturbed at the portrait's right-hand edge. The note, counterfeit courtesy in the phrasing, wrong paper, correct crest. The painter, contempt concealed in gallantry, peculiar animus toward the frame. The hostess, nerves like slack wire, faultless order everywhere but the one table. The secretary, anxiety trained to resemble duty, sensitive to the sound of a door. The butler, knowledge without permission to know. He paused over motive, knowing it would not yield so readily to enumeration. Money, yes, money in the complex English fashion that prefers to pretend to be taste or service. Pride, long past its bloom, turned sour by someone else's judgment. Love in its softer register, family affection, compromised, a guardian's fear of scandal, the hunger to set things right in a way that does not ask permission. He rose and stood before the portrait again. Above the painted throat, at the soft hinge of the jaw, the varnish had crazed. Just below, in the painted lace, the filigree was a shade too emphatic. He felt the faintest springiness in the wall, the slightest give, and let his hand fall. It would do. There were still, in such houses, panels that could be persuaded to move politely. He thought with reluctance of tomorrow. There would be the formalities, statements corrected with a great show of relief and no change in substance. The theatre of the drawing room, in which all polite people agree by tacit resolution to be candid. And then the little experiment he proposed to himself. A repetition of ceremony is the best mirror of its offense. Let the tray appear again, at the same hour, in the same place, under the eye of those whose lives proceed by emeritus habits. Let the labels march to their accustomed positions. Let the decanter stand either where it must or where a hand, ungoverned by instinct, betrays itself. Fawkes had asked him before leaving whether he knew. Not yet, Alleyn had said. I think the house knows, and the house is telling us the way houses do, with small noises. One must be quiet enough to hear them. The room gave back to him nothing but the clock's softened tick, and from far within, a muffled vibration as if someone, much below, had closed a cupboard door. He made on his list a final notation that would mean little if read by anyone else. A pair of initials linked not by certainty but by a thin line of instinct. He let the pencil lie. On his way out, he passed the door to the little ante-room where the dressing cloaks still hung, their vapors caught like a last conversation. A maid had placed there, with that domestic piety which survives, in very grand houses, a posy in a jam jar. It looked both ridiculous and right. He smiled at it, very slightly, and went softly down the passage. Morning arrived, not with brilliance, but with a grey, respectful light that seemed to have tuned itself to the household's muted register. Breakfast passed with soft clinks and the delicate warfare of avoidance. Lady Ashworth's poise was faultless. Miss Vance appeared, colourless and determined, and managed a slice of toast she did not eat. Adrian Thorne, in a tweed designed to look innocent of design, spoke of London as if it were on another continent. Giles conducted the passage of dishes with an air of sacerdotal gravity. Afterwards, Alleyn asked that they join him in the long drawing-room. It was not a summons. He phrased it as a convenience. The room returned to its equilibrium at their entrance. The portrait surveyed them from above the chimney-piece, a lady with one hand upon a stone balustrade and the other upon her own composure. She had the look of someone who would keep a confidence out of manners rather than inclination. Alleyn stood at the hearth rug as if he had been there all his life. "I should be grateful," he said, "if Mr. Giles would be so kind as to set the tray precisely as it stood on the evening of Sir Julian's last night." Giles inclined. His performance was not theatrical. It was the exactitude of service. The salver, the glasses, one with the faintest ghost of a lip mark polished into oblivion, the decanter placed to the left of the spirit lamp on the side table, the tiny key to the tantalus box set, out of habit, under the lip of a Chinese bowl. Alleyn watched the movements with the quiet attention of a man to whom detail was not trinket but text. He had not asked the others to speak. Silence did most of his work, yet the silence had gradations. Lady Ashworth's was porcelain, Miss Vance's a taut thread, Thorn's a fabric he had chosen for himself. "There is an oddity," Alleyn observed, with the gentle irrelevance that disarms. "On that night the decanter stood to the right. I remember because I'm strongly left-handed and was forced to an awkward reach during my first look at things." Giles' hand paused for a fraction at the crystal stopper. "If you say so, sir." "I do, and I wonder who altered the position subsequently." "No doubt I did without thinking," Lady Ashworth said with aplomb. "A house lives by small adjustments." "Quite," Alleyn agreed, and turned to the portrait as if seeking corroboration from the past. "Forgive me. There is another small request. Miss Vance, would you mind sitting in the chair you occupied that evening? Mr. Thorn, I think you stood by the escritoire." Thorn smiled. "Do you propose a charade, Inspector? I warn you I'm better at tableau than at pantomime." "I propose only a cautionary rehearsal," Alleyn said. He took up a glass and replaced it, not because it mattered, but because it did. "We have all, I think, agreed that Sir Julian poured his own sherry." No one approached him with the decanter. They had rehearsed this answer before. The assurances were bland and brief. When they had finished, not saying anything, Alleyn thanked them. Then he asked quietly if Mr. Thorn would walk with him as far as the picture gallery. The request was as undramatic as an errand. The gallery, with its northern light, had the coolness of a chapel. Alleyn led Thorn to the Gainsborough and stood, hands linked behind him, as if acknowledging a third presence in their colloquy. "You understand," Alleyn said, "that Sir Julian's notes have been found." "A collector's notes are inevitably copious," Thorn replied. "One is accustomed to inventories of obsession." "Among them," Alleyn continued, "a penciled line, your name, and the word forgery. It would be uncivil to misquote. He had underlined the word twice." Thorn's laugh was charming and a shade too carefully modulated. Sir Julian adored his dramas. He might write forgery if a frame were altered. He liked the theatre of scholarship. Alleyn inclined his head. "He did, but he was also a precise man. You know that he had the backboard of this picture removed last week? The conservator reported a discrepancy in the canvas tacking edge. It is a technical matter. People who do not dabble in such things have no reason to know it." Thorn did not look at the backboard. He looked instead at Alleyn. "Then you must discuss your technicalities with your conservator." "I have," Alleyn said, "and with those in London who trade in reputations as briskly as in pictures." He let the words fall without weight. "Suppose, Mr. Thorn, that Sir Julian had intended to make an announcement. Suppose he had chosen to do so here, before a small audience. The social consequences would have been tiresome." "Tiresome," Thorn agreed very softly. "The temptation," Alleyn said, "to forestall tedium must have been considerable. For someone." There was a small movement in Thorn's shoulders, almost a shrug and almost a shiver. "Inspector, you cannot mean, I mean nothing aloud," Alleyn said. "I observed that last night you inquired of Miss Vance whether Sir Julian kept duplicates of his catalogues in London. You asked it as if idly." In my experience, idleness has a curiously purposeful gait. Thorne was silent. The portrait watched them with her late-century equanimity. Somewhere in the house, a clock refused to strike. "Let us be frank, Mr. Thorne," Alleyn said, and his voice was what people trusted in him for, civil and exact. "A life has ended. The manner of its ending has the look of design. I do not propose here to attach that design to a name. Not yet, but this afternoon I shall ask you all to sit with me, and I shall put a few small matters where they belong. It will be private. I should dislike the presence of scandal. You understand why." Thorne's hand touched the gilded molding and withdrew. "Perfectly," he said, and even now found a smile. "One does not hang laundry in galleries." "No," Alleyn said. "One does not." He stepped back. "Thank you for your patience. We will reconvene at 4. As they returned along the corridor, the house resumed its whispering, timbers, carpets, the discreet breath of closed rooms. The portrait was left to its quiet, and the day moved with the decorum of heavy curtains toward an appointment it had long anticipated. By morning, the house had recovered its immaculate surfaces. Footmen moved with the circumspection of men in a church, and the rooms smelt faintly of beeswax and old roses. Alleyn breakfasted sparingly, and, after a telephone call that yielded the expected confirmation couched in a chemist's uneager diction, took himself below stairs. Mr. Giles received him in the pantry as one receives a solicitor, respectfully and with a certain moral fortitude. The butler's domain was exact, a row of decanters arranged like a squadron, their labels turned each at a precise angle, napery folded with geometric finality, the long table softly shining. "You gave me, Mr. Giles, a list of what you call the household movements on the night Sir Julian died," Alleyn said, turning a cut-glass stopper under his fingers. "May I trespass a little further?" "You're most welcome to do so, sir," Giles replied. "It is our wish to assist you in every way consistent with our duties." "Just so. I'm told Sir Julian took his customary glass in here first and then again in the drawing-room?" "That was his habit, sir. I drew the wine at 6 in the library for Sir Julian's papers, and at 9:30 I prepared the tray for the drawing-room. His lordship," the title, bestowed by habit if not by fact, came with a gentle reverence, "preferred to have the second glass after he had, if I may say, arranged his thoughts." Alleyn set down the stopper. "On that night, the decanter, was it left precisely as you always leave it?" For a moment, Giles's composure thinned. "It was not, sir. When I returned to the table, the decanter stood a little short of its place and the stopper's head faced toward the window. I invariably align it to the center. It is my small exactitude." "And the tray?" The napkin was turned a quarter round as though to hide a flaw. "There is a faint tea stain on one corner of that napkin which I ignore because it is known only to me. On that night, the stain was tucked under the silver. Luke, pardon me, sir, the second footman, would not have done so." "Who would?" Giles' eyes abolished expression. "It is not my part to suppose." "Yet you notice," Alleyn said gently, "and make a note of it to yourself." "Thank you. Will you this evening arrange the drawing-room as you did that night? The same tray, the same decanter, the same slight formality, and then, Mr. Giles, will you allow someone else to touch it? I want to see who cannot resist correcting what is wrong." Giles bowed. "It shall be done." Alleyn returned to the long gallery where the portrait presided and stood with his hands behind his back. Adrian Thorne came in presently, unannounced, as those of a certain sort do when their nerves will not tolerate corridors. "I was told you wished to see me," Thorne said. He looked as though he had considered a suit and chosen a pose instead. The grey eyes were bright and a degree too available. "In due course," Alleyn said. "We shall have a little gathering this evening. I should like you to attend. There's a matter of varnish that wants discussing." "Varnish?" Thorne's smile was prettily incredulous. "My dear Inspector, One must be careful with words of that sort in a house like this. They have not resisted them, Alleyn returned. You knew Sir Julian well enough to advise him. Well enough, Thorn said, but not so well as to be responsible for his addictions. It was deftly said and placed on the mantelpiece like a carefully chosen ornament. Alleyn did not disturb it. He found Lady Ashworth afterwards in the small morning room, seated at a writing table and looking, he thought, more composed than she cared to be. "Is it a terrible imposition to ask that you be present this evening?" he inquired. "I promise you there will be nothing of the theatrical." "Nothing in this house ever is," she said, and then, as if the line had been too pointed, softened it with a glance. "Yes, Inspector, whatever you require." "Thank you. One other small thing. The notes Sir Julian kept, those dealing with the portrait. There is an entry, late, that mentions a name. If you should find it, I should be grateful." She paused with her hand on the drawer. "I've no wish to see any more of his lists," she said, as if she confessed a pettiness that had grown too familiar. "But I will ask Giles to have them ready." Miss Vance he met upon the stairs. She was pale and had that particular resigned air of the convalescent who has decided to be well. "I hope," she said with a strained civility, "that this is nearly over." "It will be gentler than you think," said Alleyn. At dusk, the drawing-room gathered them like a careful hostess. Lamps made islands of light. The portrait waited in its bay. Giles, with the dignity of a right, brought in the tray and set it down upon the center table. The decanter gleamed, its stopper's head not quite straight. The napkin lay with its imperceptible sin put front and center. They took their places. The small talk moved softly. Alleyn let it go on a while, standing where the reflection of the room and the painted face met and merged in the window glass. He saw in that silvered surface the small, unfailing habits asserting themselves, a hand that always straightened, a hand that always deferred, a hand that reached. He said, without looking at them, "Now, if you please, we will go through it, only as far as habit takes us." And when he turned, the room was very quiet, and the portrait seemed absurdly to listen. Morning brought with it a clear light that made the old house seem at once exposed and impenetrable. Alleyn, who liked a house to introduce itself before he asked questions of its inhabitants, had already made his unobtrusive circuit. Hall, morning room, the corridor that narrowed briefly where a Victorian hand had economized on space, the library with its stern leather ranks. At 11, as arranged, they came to him in the drawing-room, where the portrait maintained its still surveillance and the window admitted a draught that turned the silk curtains into faintly breathing things. Lady Ashworth entered first, precise and composed, a silver pin in her lapel as if to anchor her. Eleanor Vance followed, pale and chastened by her recent indisposition, her hands clasped against herself as if to still their quiver. Adrian Thorne came last, a flutter of a pocket handkerchief, a smile pitched at courteous neutrality. Mr. Giles, impassive as a carved saint, stepped in with the tray. "If you will forgive a small theatre," Alleyn said, "I should like to observe a ritual as it was observed on the night of Sir Julian's death. Mr. Giles, the refreshment, exactly as it would have been." "Very good, sir," said Giles, and set the tray upon a low table near the portrait. The sherry decanters, one square, one round. The small glasses, the lemon slices in their shallow silver dish. The order of things was exact, and yet to Alleyn's eye, not yet resolved. Lady Ashworth looked at the arrangement as a hostess might peruse the flowers. "It is a melancholy reenactment, Inspector." "Melancholy, yes," Alleyn said softly, "but useful. Sir Julian's habits were regular?" "Exceedingly," Lady Ashworth said. "One could set one's watch by them. He was a man of rule." "Quite a comfort," murmured Thorne lightly. "In art and in life." "And in service," Giles said. And one might have thought he meant no more than the efficacy of a well-timed tray, but Alleyn heard the note of loyalties that would not improvise. Sir Julian favoured a particular decanter? Alleyn asked, as if idle curiosity had alighted there. The square, sir, said Giles with no hesitation. It was his father's. He preferred it. Lady Ashworth inclined her head. Yes. And you, Miss Vance? Eleanor's fingers tightened. The square, Inspector. Sir Julian liked things to repeat themselves. And you, Mr. Thorne? Thorne considered the two decanters with an appreciative air. The round is the prettier glass, he said. One might, on a night of experiment, be seduced, but I defer to household expertise. Quite, said Alleyn, and let the silence place itself. On that night, Mr. Giles. The square was in its place when I laid the tray, Giles answered. When I returned, it had been shifted, and the round had been touched. Touched, Alleyn repeated. The stopper displaced and set askew, Giles said. Not as I should have set it. One does not notice such things, Inspector, unless one is accustomed. Alleyn nodded. Thorne had taken out his cigarette case, but did not indulge. The house did not seem to allow smoke without formal sanction. He replaced it and smiled at Eleanor as if to soften Giles' implication. There is one other thing, Alleyn said gently. He went to the window and opened it a little. The silk curtains whispered, and the portrait, with its powdered dignity, seemed to murmur in sympathy. On certain afternoons, Sir Julian liked the window as it is now. He said the room breathed better. Yes, said Lady Ashworth. He spoke, too, Alleyn went on, of the portrait's voice. A fancy, no doubt, but one that pleased him. He would stand there. Alleyn placed himself where Sir Julian must once have stood, and remark upon its confidences. It is odd the fondness we develop for our own arrangements. Thorne laughed softly. Charming. A collector's superstition. Perhaps, said Alleyn. Mr. Giles, would you mind placing the sherry glass where Sir Julian would have rested it? Giles, with a politeness that was almost an assertion, took the small glass and set it by the right-hand arm of the central settee, nearer the portrait than a guest might prefer. Alleyn watched the motion, then glanced at Eleanor. She was watching Giles' hands as if they executed a minor liturgy. You see, Alleyn said, the little theatre helps us recall. Who entered this room and touched what was not theirs? That is the curious point. Forgive me, one more question for each of you. Miss Vance, on the night in question, did you write any letters? Eleanor's lips parted. She glanced at Lady Ashworth, who remained as composed as a porcelain figure. No, Eleanor said. No. Giles looked very briefly at the lemon dish. Alleyn did not pursue. He let the whispering of the curtains resume its small gossip. Thank you. I have what I need. This afternoon, if you will indulge me once more, I should be grateful if you would all meet here at 5. We shall, I hope, have done with our theatre by then. Thorne's smile altered by some fine degree. A finale, Inspector? Only a coda, Alleyn said. The melody has already been played. He closed the window. The portrait ceased to whisper. The room accepted the stillness. It would, he thought, be kinder to bring the truth to them with the same restraint the house demanded. No violence to their arrangements, merely a reordering. The tray stood between them like a modest altar to habit and to the betraying charm of deviation. By the time the rain came, soft and almost apologetic upon the stone terraces, Ashworth Manor had resumed the appearance of composure that great houses adopt after shock. Blinds at their customary angle, brass polished, flowers set with a correctness that suggested continuity rather than celebration. The scandal had passed through like a draught, felt, resented, and discreetly remedied by the closing of doors. Inspector Alleyn walked the long gallery one last time. The portrait faced the length of carpeted shadow, serene as ever. It had presided over luncheon, whispered to afternoon tea, reflected the glimmer of decanters and pianoforte. It would preside still, its ambiguity now part of its charm and part of its sentence. The whisper had been heard. The room, chastened, had gone on, speaking of other things. He found Mr. Giles in the herb garden where the rain lay like breath upon the foxglove spikes. The butler wore an old mackintosh which diminished neither his dignity nor his air of permanence. He inclined his head as if greeting a thought he had expected. "I have requested that the gardener remove these, sir," he said. His carefully gloved hand indicated the foxgloves. "They are handsome, but perhaps not altogether suitable to our purpose." "Quite," said Alleyn. The pause between them was companionable. It was Giles who, with stately reluctance, offered the final piece he had kept in reserve, not from malice, but from that loyalty to households which persists in certain men as piety. "On that last evening," he said, "Mr. Thorne came in by the east corridor. It is not a usual entrance for gentlemen. I did not mention it at first because, as you will understand, one does not offer conjecture about guests. I told you when I felt I could do so without upsetting matters beyond what was necessary." Alleyn nodded. "You knew your master's habits, Mr. Giles, and that the decanter had been moved." Giles inclined his head, just enough to acknowledge the accuracy without betraying the pride of his profession. "Sir Julian was particular. Advertisement is one thing, sir, and ritual is another. I've always felt the household breathes more easily when rituals are respected." "So do I," said Alleyn. He left Giles among the herbs and the obsolete foxgloves and returned to the house. In Lady Ashworth's sitting room he found her at the escritoire, where she had been writing notes in a hand that was recognizable and, Alleyn suspected, often imitated by charitable committees. She rose with the unstudied grace of one who has practiced dignity until it became second nature. "You are leaving us," she said. "It was not a question." "For a time," said Alleyn. "There will be formalities. My colleague will attend to them." "I should like the picture to remain," she said, glancing past him at the framed miniature of Sir Julian on the mantel, its gentler truth unassailable by scholarship. "I repeated myself last evening, I know, but I wished to be sure you understood. It is, in a sense, what remains of Julian's delight." "I understood," said Alleyn. She considered him with grave curiosity. "You have a manner of fitting people into their own solitude, Inspector, rather than dragging them out into the light and making them shiver." "It spares the light," said Alleyn, and she smiled, a just perceptible movement, like a flower adjusting itself to sun. He saw Eleanor Vance in the music room. She sat at the open piano without playing, one hand resting lightly on the keys as if laying an apology upon them. She looked up quickly. "I am to go down to my aunt in Devon," she said. "Letters to write, walks to take. Dr. Pemberton says sea air is a tonic. Do you think it is?" "For some illnesses," said Alleyn. "For others, an inland wind does very well." She colored a little, then laughed, an unschooled sound that came as a relief to them both. "I have been very foolish." "You were very young," said Alleyn. "The distinction matters." He moved to the window and looked out at the rain working its quiet changes on the lawn. "There is a virtue in time and ordinary company. Accept it when it comes." Do you ever know when a thing is true?" she asked abruptly and intensely. "I mean, beyond proofs, before proofs." "Sometimes," said Alleyn, "but then one must behave as if one did not. It keeps one honest." She thought about this, as if filing it under a heading to be consulted later when the air was clearer. At the last, he stood again before the portrait in the great drawing-room where the day, growing undecided, had taken on a pewter glow. The figure on the canvas appeared composed of evening and music and that habit of elegance which is both defect and defense. Lady Ashworth's cat walked in, ignored him, and sprang on to the ottoman with a private air. There was a crackle in the fire, the polite sound of rain, and the sense, he knew it now as experience, that a story had been told as far as it could be, the remainder belonging to silence. He thought of Thorne and of the fragile economies of esteem that make theft seem almost like self-preservation. He thought too of Sir Julian and of the steady, inconvenient passion for truth that is the only safeguard against such economies. Between them, the portrait hung, not false enough to be ugly, not true enough to be safe. When he took his hat in the hall, Giles stood aside as if to allow not only a man, but an episode to pass. Alleyn paused, remembering an earlier question. "If you will forgive me, when you replaced the sherry decanter that night, you set the stopper at a slight angle." "Indeed, sir," said Giles, untroubled. "One cannot always be explicit." "No," said Alleyn, and went out into the rain. The drive swept him toward the Alleyn road. The house receded to its proportions in the landscape. The rain deepened and then gentled, as rain will. At a turn he glanced back and saw, indistinctly through the trees, the high window of the drawing-room, a faint rectangle of light. He imagined, without superstition, the portrait within it, still whispering its ambiguous comfort to those who required it. Truth, he thought, is rarely loud in such places. It arrives in small adjustments, a decanter's angle, a footman's pause, a woman's refusal to remove what she loves because it is not what she was told. It asks and will be answered, if one listens. He turned his face to the weather and let the silence complete the case. The portrait behind him kept its counsel.